The Galactic Concord had existed for 11,000 years, and in all that time, it had seen empires rise and fall like waves upon an endless shore. 342 species called the Concord their home, and they lived in a peace that was built upon one simple truth, the truth that war was expensive and cooperation was cheap, and that dead civilizations could not trade or share knowledge or build wonders that would last forever. At the heart of the Concord stood a place that every species knew and every species feared to visit. And this place was called the Archive of Extinctions. The archive was not a museum, and it was not a memorial, and it was not a place of mourning. It was a warning carved into the bones of dead worlds and written in the languages of species that no longer existed. Every civilization that had ever been wiped from existence had an entry in the archive. And every civilization that had done the wiping had an entry as well. And any species thinking about starting a war would first visit this place and read what had happened to those who came before them. Elder Archivist Velthrani had served the archive for 300 years, and in that time she had seen many things that troubled her sleep, but nothing had troubled her quite like the small metal probe that had drifted into Concord space on an ordinary morning. The probe was primitive by Concord standards, and its engines were slow, and its sensors were weak, and its armor could have been pierced by a child's toy butt. None of these things mattered to Velthrani, because what she cared about was the data stored inside. She was Scythian, and her people had a gift that other species did not understand and could not replicate. They could feel the weight of futures pressing against the present, like water against a dam. When Velthrani touched the probe's cultural database and began to read about the species that had built it, she felt something she had not felt in 200 years. She felt afraid. The species called themselves human, and they came from a world called Earth, and everything about them screamed danger in a language that only she could hear. Their planet was a death world, a place where the gravity was crushing, and the weather was violent, and predators hunted in every environment from the frozen poles to the boiling equator. They had evolved not as the dominant species of their world, but as prey, animals that had refused to accept their place in the food chain and had clawed their way to the top through nothing but spite and cleverness, and an absolute refusal to die. Their history was a record of constant warfare, tribe against tribe, and nation against nation, and ideology against ideology, and yet somehow they had not destroyed themselves. Instead, they had taken all that violence and channeled it into building things and exploring things and reaching for the stars with hands that still remembered how to make weapons. Velthrani called an emergency session of the High Council, and this was something that no archivist had done in 6 centuries. She stood before the representatives of 300 species, and she spoke in a voice that did not waver even though her hearts were pounding. "I have studied the newcomers, and I bring you a warning that I hope you will heed," she said. "Do not engage this species with hostility, and do not corner them, and do not threaten their young. They are survivors of a death world, and they have been fighting since before they could walk upright, and their entire civilization is built on the bones of everything that ever tried to kill them." The council listened, and the council took notes, and most species decided that caution was the wisest path. But not all species valued wisdom. The Vrakthern Dominion was an empire of 7 conquered worlds, and they had built their power on the simple principle that strength was the only law that mattered. They had subjugated dozens of species, and they had crushed rebellions, and they had made themselves feared throughout their sector of space. High Warlord Krethven was the ruler of the Dominion, and he was a creature of war who had never lost a battle and had never shown mercy, and had never once considered that he might be wrong about anything. When he reviewed the human cultural database, he did not feel fear, he felt opportunity. The humans were young, and their fleet was small, and they controlled only a single star system, and they spent most of their time fighting each other. "Look at them," Krethvan said to his generals as they studied the data together. "They are soft flesh and short lives, and they cannot even unite. Against common threats, they are divided and weak, and they will fall before us like all the others." His generals agreed, because disagreeing with Krethvan was not something that anyone did twice. Velfrani learned of the Dominion's interest, and she did something she had never done before. She sent a personal message to the warlord himself. "I know what you are planning," she wrote, "and I am begging you to reconsider. You see their wars and you call them weak, but I see their wars and I understand. Something you do not. They have never stopped fighting because they do not know how to stop fighting. They do not surrender, and they do not forget, and they do not forgive. Warlord, I have seen the futures pressing against this moment, and in every future where you attack them, I see fire and I see death, and I see the end of everything you have built. Please choose any other enemy." Krethvan read the message, and he laughed, and he deleted it without sending a reply. The Scythene were known for their caution and their warnings, and Krethvan had ignored their warnings before, and nothing bad had happened. He gave the order to his admirals, and 600 warships began their journey toward a small yellow star on the edge of explored space. The fleet moved in silence, and the crews prepared for an easy victory, and no one among them understood what they were about to wake up. Velfrani felt the future shift, and she knew that her warning had been ignored, and she returned to the archive and began preparing a new entry. She did not know yet what would fill that entry, but she knew with terrible certainty that something was coming, something that would change the galaxy forever. The humans did not know that death was sailing toward them, and they went about their lives, and they argued with each other, and they dreamed their small dreams. They had no idea that they were about to be tested in a way that no species had ever been tested before. But the galaxy was about to learn something that the Vraktherm would pay. From blood, humanity was not an enemy you could surprise, and humanity was not an enemy you could frighten, and humanity was not an enemy you could survive. The Vrakthan Armada entered the Sol system on a Tuesday morning, and they came without warning and without declaration and without mercy. 600 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and formed into attack formations and began moving toward the small blue planet that hung in the darkness like a jewel waiting to be stolen. High Warlord Krethvan watched from his command ship, and he felt nothing but confidence, because this was how the Dominion had always operated: strike fast and strike hard and break the enemies. Well, before they even knew what was happening, the human orbital stations were the first targets, and they died in fire and silence as Vrakthan weapons tore through metal and glass and flesh. Then the bombardment of the planet began. Great cities that had stood for centuries vanished in columns of light and heat, and the screams of millions were cut short in an instant. New York and Shanghai and Lagos and Mumbai, names that meant nothing to the Vrakthan, but meant everything to the humans who lived and loved and dreamed in those places. In the first 3 hours of the attack, 18 million human beings died, and the number kept climbing with every passing minute. Krethvan expected surrender by sunset, because that was what always happened when the Dominion showed its strength. The weak species would beg for mercy, and the strong species would negotiate. And either way, the killing would stop and the conquest would begin. But the humans did not surrender. Instead, something strange happened, something that made the Vrakthan officers look at each other in confusion. Every human communication channel went silent. Not destroyed and not jammed, but simply silent. As if every human on every world and every station and every ship had stopped talking at exactly the same moment. For 47 minutes, there was nothing but quiet, and the Vrakthan began to wonder if they had somehow killed the entire species without realizing it. Then the silence ended. A single transmission burst across every frequency and every channel, and every receiver in the solar system, and it came from everywhere at once, from Earth and from Luna and from Mars and from the asteroid belt and from places the Vrakthun had not even known the humans occupied. The voice belonged to a woman, and later the galaxy would learn that her name was Director Amara Okonkwo, and that her city had been among the first to burn, and that she had watched her children die in the light of Vrakthun weapons. Her voice was calm and cold, and it carried no fear and no desperation and no plea for mercy. "You have made a mistake that cannot be undone," she said. "You came to our home without warning, and you killed our people without reason, and you thought that this would make us afraid. But you do not understand what you have done." The Vrakthun commanders listened with amusement because they had heard threats before, and threats meant nothing against 600 warships. "For all of our history, we have fought each other," the voice continued. "We have divided ourselves by nation and by religion and by ideology, and we have shed oceans of our own blood in wars that accomplished nothing. But you have given us something we have never had before." There was a pause, and in that pause something changed in the voice, something that made even Krethvan lean forward in his command chair. "You have given us a common enemy." The transmission showed footage from every corner of the human territory. Soldiers who had been pointing weapons at each other across contested borders were now shaking hands and sharing ammunition. Political leaders who had refused to speak for decades were now sitting in the same rooms and making plans. Scientists who had worked for rival nations were now sharing research and combining their knowledge. Ships that had been built for different fleets were now flying in the same formations. "Every grudge is forgotten," the voice said. "Every border is erased and every old wound is healed, because none of that matters anymore." The footage showed factories retooling and civilians volunteering and children being evacuated to hidden shelters while their parents took up weapons. "You are now the only thing that humanity sees, the only enemy we care about, and the only target we will aim for, and we will not stop until you are broken." The voice grew harder and colder, and something in it made the younger Vrakthun officers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Run if you can, pray if you believe, it will not matter." The transmission ended, and for a long moment, no one on the Vrakthun command ship spoke. Then Krethvan laughed, and his generals laughed with him, because what else could they do? The humans were outnumbered and outgunned, and their fleet was tiny compared to the Dominion's might. "They are brave," Krethvan admitted. "I will give them that. The bravery does not stop plasma fire, and speeches do not repair hulls." He ordered the bombardment to continue, and he ordered his ground forces to prepare for landing operations, and he settled back in his chair to watch the conquest unfold. But something was different now, and even Krethvan could feel it if he was honest with himself. The humans were not running, and they were not hiding, and they were not doing any of the things that conquered species usually did. Instead, they were fighting back. Small human ships that should have fled were charging directly at Vrakthun cruisers, and some of them were ramming into the larger vessels at full speed. Ground defenders on Luna were holding positions that should have been impossible to hold, and they were making the Vrakthun pay for every meter in blood. Pilots were flying into certain death with something that sounded almost like joy in their voices. It made no sense. The mathematics of war said that the humans should conserve their forces and fall back and try to negotiate, but the humans seemed to have no interest in mathematics. They were not fighting to win because winning was impossible. They were fighting to hurt. They were fighting to make the Vrakthun remember this day for the rest of their existence. And in the back of his mind, Krethvan heard Velthrani's warning echoing like a bell that would not stop ringing. They do not know how to surrender. He pushed the thought away and focused on the battle, but the thought would not stay gone, and as the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, that thought would grow louder and louder until it was all he could hear. The humans were not going to stop. The humans were never going to stop. And by the time Crethvon truly understood what that meant, it would be far too late for the Vrakthan Dominion. 6 months into the war, the Vrakthan Dominion began to understand that they had made a terrible mistake. It was not one single moment that taught them this lesson, but rather 1,000 small horrors that added up to something much larger and much worse. The Galactic Concord had a phrase for the way most species fought their wars. They called it rational conflict. And it meant that both sides would count their losses and weigh them against potential gains, and eventually one side would decide that the cost was too high and they would surrender or negotiate or retreat. War was mathematics, and mathematics did not care about pride or anger or revenge. But the humans did not fight rational wars. The humans fought with something that the Concord had no word for, and that the Vrakthan could not understand. They fought with spite. In the first months of the war, the humans lost almost everything. They lost their orbital stations, and they lost their outer colonies, and they lost millions of lives, and they lost any realistic hope of victory. Any other species would have surrendered. But the humans did not surrender, and they did not negotiate, and they did not even slow down. Instead, they took every factory that still existed and converted it to military production. They took every civilian ship that could fly and strapped weapons onto it. They took mining explosives meant for asteroids and turned them into missiles that could crack open Vrakthan cruisers. Engineers worked without sleep for days at a time, and scientists pushed themselves past the point of exhaustion, and civilians who had never held a weapon in their lives learned to fight and kill and die. And then the humans did something that terrified the Vrakthan more than anything else. They captured a crashed Vrakthan ship, and they studied its shield technology, and they reverse-engineered it in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Technology that had taken the Dominion 2 centuries to develop. And the humans did not just copy it, they improved it. Vrakthan weapons that had been cutting through human hulls like paper suddenly found themselves stopped by shields that should not have existed. The Dominion's admirals studied the new human shields, and they could not understand how it was possible, and they sent reports back to Crethvon that were filled with confusion and growing fear. But the technology was not the worst part. The worst part was how the humans used it. Human pilots began flying directly into Vrakthan formations, and they would target the command ships, and they would ram into them at full speed. The shields kept them alive long enough to get close, and then they would detonate their reactors and take the Vrakthan ships with them. And as they died, they would transmit on open channels, and they would be laughing. The Vrakthan had conquered species that fought harder than the humans. They had defeated enemies with better technology than the humans. But they had never faced an enemy that laughed while dying. On the occupied colony of New Brisbane, the humans showed the Dominion what resistance really meant. The Vrakthan had landed 50,000 soldiers to pacify the population, and they had expected the humans to submit, the way other species had submitted. Instead, the humans fought for every street and every building and every room. They booby-trapped their own homes, and they ambushed Vrakthan patrols, and they disappeared into tunnels that they had dug with their bare hands. When the Vrakthan finally took a neighborhood, they would find that the humans had already rigged it to explode. The 50,000 soldiers became 40,000, and then 30,000, and then 20,000, and still the humans kept fighting. Human children would walk up to Vrakthan soldiers with explosives hidden under their clothes. Human elders would offer food that was laced with poison. Human farmers would burn their own crops rather than let the Dominion use them. The Vrakthan commander on New Brisbane sent a message to Crethvon, begging for reinforcements, and his words were haunted by something that no Vrakthan officer had felt in generations. They do not fight like soldiers. he wrote. "They fight like something else, like animals defending their territory, or like demons that do not fear death. I have never seen anything like this, and I do not know how to defeat it." But the thing that broke the Rakthun spirit was not the fighting, it was the message. Human scientists had been working on biological weapons, weapons that could target Rakthun biology specifically and leave other species unharmed. They succeeded. They created a virus that could wipe out the entire Rakthun species in a matter of months. And then they did not use it. Instead, they sent samples of the virus to Krethvan himself, along with a note. "We could end your species," the note said. "We have the power to make you extinct, and there is nothing you could do to stop us. But we are choosing not to use this weapon. Remember this mercy when we come for you." Krethvan stared at the samples, and he read the note again and again, and he finally understood what Velthrani had tried to tell him. The humans were not just fighting to survive, they were fighting to prove something. They were fighting to show the Dominion and the entire galaxy that they could have been monsters, but they chose not to be. They were fighting to demonstrate that their restraint was a choice, and that they could withdraw that choice at any moment. And that was more terrifying than any weapon. Krethvan sent a transmission to Earth requesting terms for peace. He was willing to withdraw, and he was willing to pay reparations, and he was willing to do almost anything to make this war end. The human response came back in 4 words that would echo through history. "Terms are for equals." And Krethvan realized with cold horror that the humans were not interested in peace. The humans were not going to stop until the Dominion was broken. The humans were coming, and nothing in the galaxy could stop them. In the second year of the war, the humans stopped defending and started attacking. Their fleet had grown from a handful of desperate ships into an armada that made the Rakthun admirals wake up screaming in the night. They had built new shipyards and hidden asteroids, and they had recruited crews from every corner of human space, and they had forged an army out of grief and rage and an absolute determination to make the Dominion pay for what it had done. Admiral Chen Wei stood on the bridge of the flagship Remembrance, and he looked out at the stars that led to Rakthun space. His wife had died in the first bombardment, and his children had died with her, and he had spent 18 months turning his sorrow into something useful. "All ships report ready," his tactical officer announced. Chen Wei nodded and gave the order that would change the galaxy. "Take us to war." The human fleet entered Rakthun space like a storm that had been building for 1,000 years. They did not come to conquer. The humans had learned from history that conquest only bred resentment and rebellion. Instead, they came to destroy the Dominion's ability to make war. The great shipyards of Rakthun Prime were the first targets. These massive orbital structures had built the fleet that attacked Earth, and they had built the ships that killed 18 million people in a single day. Human pilots flew through defensive fire with cold precision, and they planted charges on reactor cores, and they destroyed in hours what the Rakthun had taken centuries to build. The military academies were next. These were the places where Rakthun officers learned the art of conquest and subjugation and cruelty, the places that had trained the commanders who ordered the bombardment of human cities. Human Marines stormed these facilities, and they captured the instructors, and they burned the training records, and they made sure that no more Rakthun would learn the old ways of war. But the humans did not stop there. They dismantled the orbital defense grid around the Rakthun homeworld piece by piece, and they broadcast the destruction live to every world in the Galactic Concord. Billions of beings across 300 species watched as the Dominion that had terrorized its neighbors for generations was systematically taken apart. And then the humans did something that no one expected. They liberated the conquered worlds. The Dominion had built its empire on the backs of 7 subjugated species, and these species had lived under Rakthun rule for generations. They had forgotten what freedom felt like, and they had accepted their chains as simply the way things were. The planet Desek Prime had been conquered 300 years ago, and its people had long since given up hope. When human ships appeared in their sky, the Thesaki watched with dull eyes and waited to see what new masters would demand of them. Human marines landed in the capital city, and they pushed back the Vrakthern garrison in a battle that lasted 3 days. When the fighting was over, the humans did not raise their flag, and they did not demand tribute, and they did not install a puppet government. Instead, Colonel Yuki Tanaka, woman who had lost her entire family in the first attack on Earth, walked alone into the chamber where the Thesaki Elder Council waited. She was small by Thesaki standards, and her armor was scarred from battle, and she carried no weapons in her hands. The elders watched her with confusion, because this was not how conquerors behaved. Colonel Tanaka stopped in the center of the chamber, and she removed her helmet and she knelt in the Thesaki gesture of respect, a gesture that no outsider had ever bothered to learn. "I am not here as your conqueror," she said in a voice that was tired but gentle. "I am here as your liberator." The elders did not understand. "What do you want from us?" the eldest of them asked. "Nothing," Colonel Tanaka replied. "We did not come to rule you. We came because no one should live in chains. Your world is yours again. It has always been yours. The Vrakthern just made you forget." She stood and looked at each of the elders in turn. "If you need help rebuilding, we will stay and we will work beside you. If you wish us to leave, we will go, and we will not return unless you ask, but know this: as long as humanity exists, you will never stand alone against tyrants." There was silence in the chamber. Then the eldest of the elders did something that no Thesaki had done in 3 centuries. She wept. She wept because she had believed that kindness was dead and that the galaxy belonged only to the strong and the cruel. She wept because a species that had every reason to hate and destroy had chosen instead to free and heal. The humans liberated all 7 of the conquered worlds, and on each world they said the same thing and they made the same promise. They asked for nothing in return. The Galactic Concord watched these events unfold, and they did not know what to think. This was not how wars were supposed to end. Victors were supposed to demand reparations and territory and submission. They were not supposed to simply give freedom away. But the humans were not interested in what wars were supposed to do. They were interested in what was right. And as the last Vrakthern soldiers retreated to their homeworld, the galaxy began to understand that something new had arrived among the stars. Something that fought like a demon but showed mercy like a saint. Something that could not be conquered but did not wish to conquer. Something that called itself humanity and asked only to be treated with the same kindness it offered to others. The war was almost over, but its effects would ripple through history for 10,000 years. The war ended not with a bang, but with a silence that spread across the stars like the first light of dawn. The Vrakthern Dominion did not surrender because there was no Dominion left to surrender. The empire that had terrorized 7 worlds for 3 centuries had dissolved like morning mist, and in its place, there was only ash and memory, and the echoes of a lesson learned too late. High Warlord Krethven was captured on the bridge of his command ship as human marines cut through the last of his guards. He expected death because death was what the Vrakthern gave to defeated enemies, and he assumed that humans would do the same. But the humans did not kill him. Instead, they brought him before a tribunal. Not a human tribunal, but a joint council made up of representatives from every species the Dominion had conquered. The Zaki and Volani and Brightkin and all the others sat in judgment of the warlord who had kept them in chains. Krethvan stood before them, and he felt something he had never felt in his entire life. He felt small. The human representative spoke first, and her words were measured and calm. "We could kill you," she said, "and many would say that justice demands it. You ordered the deaths of 18 million of our people, and you enslaved billions of others, and you built an empire on suffering and fear. Krethvon waited for the sentence. But we have learned over thousands of years that killing tyrants only creates martyrs inspire vengeance, and vengeance creates new tyrants, and the cycle never ends. The human looked at the representatives of the conquered species. So we leave your fate to those you harmed. We leave it to the species you enslaved, and the worlds you burned, and the peoples you tried to erase. The tribunal deliberated for 7 days, and in the end, they chose something worse than death. They sentenced Krethvon to live. He was taken to a prison moon on the edge of known space, and he was given comfortable quarters and adequate food and access to communication networks. But the only thing he was allowed to watch was the news from his former empire. He watched as the conquered species rebuilt their worlds. He watched as the Vraktherm people, his people, struggled to find their place in a galaxy that no longer feared them. He watched as statues of himself were torn down and replaced with memorials to his victims. He watched as children were taught about the Dominion, the way human children were taught about their own historical tyrants, as a warning about what happens when power is not tempered by compassion. The last report from the prison moon said that Krethvon had not spoken a single word in 4 years. He simply sat and watched as everything he had built crumbled into nothing. On Earth, the humans began to rebuild what had been destroyed, and they did so with the help of allies they had never expected. The liberated species sent workers and resources and expertise, and they asked for nothing in return. "You gave us our freedom," the Visaki ambassador explained. "This is the least we can do." The Galactic Concord sent observers to human space, and they studied this strange new species with a mixture of fascination and fear. Elder Archivist Velthrani was among the observers, and she requested a private audience with Earth's United Council. They granted her request, and she found herself sitting across from a human who was older than any she had seen before. His name was Ambassador James Okonkwo, the father of Director Amara Okonkwo, who had delivered the famous speech on the day the sky burned. His daughter had died in the final months of the war, leading a mission to rescue prisoners from a Vraktherm labor camp. Velthrani looked at this man who had lost so much, and she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the war began. "In all my centuries, I have never seen a species fight with such fury and then show such mercy. How do you reconcile these things?" Ambassador Okonkwo was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft. "We are not a peaceful species. Elder, our history is written in blood, and we have done terrible things to each other. Things that shame us, things that we swore we would never repeat." He looked out the window at the city that was slowly rising from the ashes. "But we learned over thousands of years of terrible lessons that cruelty breeds cruelty, and mercy can break cycles that hatred cannot. We learned that the hardest thing is not winning a war. The hardest thing is winning without becoming the monster you fought against." He turned back to Velthrani. "We fight without limit because we must when someone threatens our children and our homes and our future. We become something terrifying. But we show mercy because we choose to, because we want to be better than our worst impulses." He smiled, and it was a sad smile. The Vraktherm saw our capacity for war and thought they understood us. They did not. War is what we do when we have no other choice. But what we are, what we aspire to be, is something kinder. Velthrani returned to the archive, and she created a new entry for humanity. It was not a warning like the one she had tried to give Krethvon. It was not a threat assessment like the ones that filled the archive's records. It was something new, something that had never existed in the archive before. Classification: humanity. She wrote, "Status: allies if you are worthy of alliance, enemies only if you choose to be." She paused and added a note that would be flagged with the highest priority. "They will offer you friendship first. They will offer it sincerely. For your own sake, accept it." Then she added a personal annotation, something that would be read by every archivist for generations to come. I have seen the rise and fall of empires. I have watched extinction events unfold across millennia in 11,000 years the Concord has never encountered. A species like this, they are not the strongest, and they are not the most advanced, but they are the most relentless. They do not conquer, but they cannot be conquered. They do not seek war, but they cannot be defeated in it. And, strangest of all, they genuinely wish to be friends. She saved the entry and looked at it for a long time. They came from a world that tried to kill them every day of their evolution. She added as a final note, they survived ice ages and predators and plagues in each other. They looked up at the stars and said, we want to meet whoever is out there. The Rekthorn answered with fire. Humanity answered with everything they had, and then impossibly with forgiveness. The galaxy learned something, that humanity is not an enemy you survive, but if you are lucky, if you are wise, humanity is a friend you keep forever. She closed the archive and walked out into the light of unfamiliar stars. The galaxy had changed, and it would never be the same. But for the first time in 11,000 years, Velthrani felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. She felt hope,